hope everyone can hear me okay. Please let us know if there's any issue with sound. Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Truxas, and I'm the Executive Director at the Portland Chinatown Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third presentation in our six-part Hidden History series on Chinese American history in Oregon. And before we get started, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. The Portland Chinatown Museum acknowledges and honors the Indigenous peoples and their descendants of the Lower Columbia and Willamette River region, whose lands the City of Portland and our museum currently occupy. These include Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Motlala Chinook tribes, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated tribes of Grand Ronde, and the many other Chinookan peoples who established communities along the Lower Columbia, whose descendants are today members of the Grand Ronde, Warm Springs, and Siletz Confederated Tribes of Oregon. So a little bit about today's presentation. Hidden Histories was made possible in part with the generous support and partnership of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, known as OCDP. It is an award-winning grassroots local, state, federal partnership that was conceived and initiated in underserved rural communities in southern and eastern Oregon. The research generated through these public archaeology projects is helping to update and center the history of the Chinese diaspora and Chinese Oregonians in the development of the state. Today's presentation looks at the hidden history of Oregon City's early Chinese community with historian Laura Shepard and archaeologist Michael David Lewis. And just a few points on logistics. We have turned closed captions on, and you can share your questions and comments via the chat and the Q&A functions, and we will read them aloud for our panelists at the end of their presentation to make sure they get it. And I just also want to take a moment to note how grateful we are to OCDP to be doing this second series. It brings so many wonderful scholars together in conversation and just builds out such a rich history for us to share here at the museum. So first up, we're thrilled to introduce both of our esteemed panelists. Laura Ferguson Shepard is the founder and principal historian of Time and Place Historical Research. She specializes in the history of the American West and public history, with a commitment to working closely with communities on projects that bring their history to light. She is a research affiliate with the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. Laura serves on the board of the Oregon Historical Quarterly and previously worked as a curator at the High Desert Museum, a visiting assistant professor at Whitman College, and served on the Oregon Heritage Commission. She earned her doctorate in history from the University of Michigan. And then Michael David Lewis is the senior archaeologist in the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, where he leads the Archaeology and Research Laboratory. His research focuses on integrating indigenous approaches to archaeology, ecology, and historiography with current technological advances in field recording, research methodologies, and data analysis. Michael has over 10 years' experience as a professional archaeologist in the Great Basin and Pacific Northwest, including employment with private sector cultural resource management, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Michael grew up in Berkeley, California, and Gaston, Oregon. He obtained a BA in Philosophy and History of Science and Mathematics and an MA in Eastern Classics from St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. At the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, he earned an MS and PhD in archaeology and anthropology with a focus on applied stable isotope ecology and the American Southwest. So you can see our panelists are quite committed to the topics they'll be presenting on today, and we are thrilled to pass the mic to Laura Shepard to get us started. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you. Our presentation is titled 7 Decades on Main Street, The Hidden History of Oregon City's Chinese Community. Today, we're presenting a joint project between the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. We worked closely with Reese Edwards, who is the Historic Preservation Manager for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde's Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and Chelsea Rose, who's the Director of Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology and Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project's Principal Investigator. Today's talk has three parts. First, Michael will discuss the larger project that this work is a part of, which is an effort by the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde to expand our understanding of Oregon City's history through research with and on communities that have previously been overlooked. Secondly, I'll share the history of the Chinese American community in Oregon City at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th century. And I'll also discuss some of the frameworks that we drew on to get at this history, to think about hidden histories in particular. Lastly, we'll share three case studies, stories of Chinese Americans who lived in Oregon City in the early decades of the 20th century. We'll conclude by reflecting on approaches that may be helpful for research into other communities hidden in plain sight in the historical record. Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Right. Slakayam, everyone. Good morning. Um, my name's Michael Lewis. I am senior archaeologist for Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I want to take the next 5 or 10 minutes really just to frame up how this project came to be. And with that, I want to note before I start that while I work for the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, I am not myself of tribal descent. So if I slip into a we, it is from that position and relationship. So, Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde is a sovereign government in Western Oregon comprised of over 27 tribes and bands that lived throughout Western Oregon, Southwest Washington, and Northern California. The tribes have lived here since time immemorial, but in the 1850s, with the arrival of the United States government, a series of treaties caused those tribes to be removed from their uh, homelands to the Grand Ronde Reservation. And those homelands were ceded to the United States government. The extent of those ceded lands is shown on the map in the black outline. The historic reservation is shown as the little red box off to the left. After the 1850s, for about 100 years, these tribes lived together and formed a government on the reservation. The United States slowly eroded the land base of that reservation, and by 1954, the U.S. government decided that it no longer needed to uphold its treaty rights with Grand Ronde, and unilaterally terminated its recognition of the tribes. 30 years later, and after much petition and litigation, the United States recognized that it could not legally do that, and recognition of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde was restored within the United States. Since restoration, the tribe has worked on building out health, education infrastructure, employment opportunities, and has been slowly purchasing back land both within its historic reservation and also throughout its ceded lands. In 2019, the tribe purchased the Tumwata Village property, which is 23 acres in Oregon City, and comprises the oldest portion of the city. Laura, could you do next slide, please? So, Tumwata is the name given for Willamette Falls. And Willamette Falls is a major place in tribal history. It is a place that shows up in the economy, in the traditional stories of multiple tribes. It was the major salmon fishery for the Willamette Valley system. And there are 3 ancestral village sites around the falls. One of those village sites had in the 1850s, a chief who signed treaties ceding land to the United States. Their descendants still reside at Grand Ronde today. The falls were also of interest for early non-native settlement. When the Hudson Bay Company came in under John McLaughlin, It recognized the potential of the falls for industrial purposes and for transportation purposes, and established first a trading center and later uh, the first mills in the area. Um, Oregon City would be set just downriver of the falls. It is the first platted city on the West Coast, and would end up being the end and goal of the Oregon Trail during American emigration to the Oregon Territory. Um, for the past 200 years, there has been near continual industrial development on the site. Everything from grist mills and sort of a small farming hub to larger scale transportation to woolen production, timber production, paper production, newsprint. 200 years of watching urbanization and industrialization happen in this space. Today, Grand Ronde has purchased the property and over the next 10 or 15 years is redeveloping it as Tumwata Village, which is envisioned as a modern native urban village. If you're interested in details, you can go to tumwatavillage.org, where the tribe periodically posts updates on what is happening. But this is a decadal scale development, and it's a decadal scale development in what is perhaps one of the, if not the most archaeologically complex places in the Northwest. And so the Tribal Historic Preservation Office um, has taken the lead in thinking about how we relate to those cultural resource obligations, both in terms of legal framework, but also in terms of our obligations to history. Next slide, please. So, in thinking about these obligations, one thing that our office has run into is the difference between the sort of official historic narrative, and I'm using official here in a slightly ironic way. You can see the scare quotes, but the narrative that we've had handed down to us from previous decades about Oregon City versus what Grand Ronde's experience of the same events are. So, if I had to draw a cartoon of the official narrative, I would say it's something like the Hudson Bay Company arrives under McLaughlin, Native Americans are removed, immigrants arrive along the Oregon Trail, and mills and industry develop. Those are sort of the four epoch-making events if we view this, from what I learned in high school. And I think it's a powerful narrative. It has its origins in the 19th century when the U.S. was expanding. It's built into the all of our like historical iconography of the place. So I've thrown up a picture painted in 1850. The field sketch for this was like 1847, 1848. You can see all of the elements of this narrative in that picture. So if you notice off to the left, there is a native couple. Note that they're painted as sort of a Eastern woodland type because this is being painted back in DC. You can see a wagon coming in on the down Main Street. You can see mills in the background. You can see nascent industry. From the mid 19th century, this idea of American expansion and industrial development is really what sculpted the perception of the West. And even for us today who are aware of the problems with this narrative, it's still stuck in our minds. We're still forced to respond to it in some way. Um, and one way to get around that, rather than just banging your head against, these events happen, but like, did they happen in this way, is to think about these same events from a different perspective. And so I'd like to take a moment and show you Grand Ronde's uh, understanding and experience of these same events. Next slide. So this diagram is taken out of a publication we have up on Tumwata Village. And Grand Ronde's experience of this place really goes back to time immemorial, for as long back as we can think and more. And tribes have been here at this place engaging with the landscape and doing practice for thousands and tens of thousands of years. The colonial occupation of this place has really only been the last 200 years. And so part of Grand Ronde's experience is seeing this place from deep time depth, but then also thinking about what happens in those last 200 years. So in 1850, we have legal removal of Native peoples from the Oregon City area. Um, After that, Grand Ronde's connection to this place does not stop. We have Grand Ronde families and Grand Ronde tribal members who continue to come back to this place, persisting in doing practice, persisting in living uh, in the place that their ancestors had lived. And so one question that we came up with is, why is this sort of persistence not showing up in the official narrative? Is it just that it wasn't useful historically when that narrative was developed to those who developed it? Or is there something else going on? And I think it's easy to write off this type of discrepancy as something just in the past, but it is still affecting how we do things today. And part of it is that we don't know what we're looking for when we are looking for signs of persistence in a place. So let me give you a quick example. Next slide. So this is a photograph of Oregon City taken from the West Lynn side in, and I'm going to totally blank on this now, I believe we are 1868. And I love this photograph. It was done with a large format glass plate camera. The detail is amazing. I blew up a, like 4 by 3 foot version of this and threw it onto our lab walls to help me think about where things were on the property. And I'm looking in the back and I'm seeing mills and I'm seeing houses and I'm trying to trace where they are on the landscape. And then one day, a colleague of mine walks in who is a tribal member and a practitioner and says, "Oh, that's a very nice photo of a sweat you have." And for those of you who don't know, a sweat or a sweat lodge is a structure uh, made out of wooden branches and used for steam bathing for health and spiritual purposes. And I say, what are you talking about? Where is the sweat in the photo? And Laura, if you would move the slide forward. She says, it's right there in the foreground. I didn't see the sweat because I wasn't looking for it. And I wasn't looking for it because I was not connected to a practice that would let me see that. This, and sorry if this is slightly rambling, but this experience is what led directly into uh, the project that Laura's about to present. So next slide. So as I was going through trying to trace where different buildings were in order to make plans about, how we should approach archaeology on site, one of the things that I found highly useful are insurance maps, historic insurance maps that I'm sure everyone is thrilled with. But the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company generated many, many maps of urban areas all over the US in order to calculate fire risk. And they are remarkable documents. They tell you about building construction, they tell you about size of buildings, and sometimes they tell you about who is in the building. And so as I went through the series of maps for this property, I found a block between 3rd Street and 4th Street, in which half of the businesses on the Sanborn insurance map are marked as Chinese owned. And I go, this is cool. Haven't heard much about this before, and so start doing some sort of shallow dive into the literature. Go, what do we know about this? And I find an official narrative, and you can see this even on things like the Oregon Encyclopedia. In 1886, there is a anti-Chinese riot and the violent expulsion of the Chinese community from Oregon City. And then the narrative stopped. And I went, well, okay, I've got an 1884 map. I can see, yes, we've got a block with a lot of Chinese businesses that fits with this narrative. But then I went to the 1888 series, and that's the one on the bottom of the page. We've still got 2 Chinese laundries. And then I went to the 1890 series. There are still Chinese businesses, the 1892 series. And I went, what is going on? What I'm seeing on the map doesn't match the narrative that I'm seeing from a, quick dive into the literature. Um, what's going on and what am I not seeing? Because in the same way that I didn't see the sweat, I'm not sure, I'm certainly not familiar enough with Chinese diasporic literature to be able to see what the signals would be for seeing people in place. And so that's really when our office contacted the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project and said, can you help us out? Can you crack open this dissonance we're seeing between the narratives that we have access to and what we're seeing on the insurance maps? And with that, I will hand it back to Laura.
Thank you so much, Michael. And so here you're looking at a map that we created that highlights all of the buildings in the Tumwata Village site with connections to Oregon City's Chinese American history from the 1880s to around the 19-teens. And as Michael mentioned, in the years after that, the site became increasingly industrial, including holding a paper mill. So to learn more about the Chinese American community in Oregon City, we drew on several different archival sources, including newspapers, census records, Sanborn fire insurance maps, immigration documents, and photographs. And all of these historical sources provided some valuable information, but they all had some drawbacks as well. And that was part of why we really wanted to bring them all together and kind of look at how they intersected and how we could kind of read them against one another. Newspapers, for example, have their own political leanings. Census enumerators often undercounted Chinese residents, and Chinese Americans had little incentive to ensure that they were counted in the census records. And because the Sanborn maps play such a significant role, I want to share a little bit more about their history in particular. The Sanborn fire insurance maps provide a wealth of information about cities over time. Daniel A. Sanborn, a surveyor from Massachusetts, founded the company in 1867. Fire was a routine occurrence in 19th century cities, and the maps provided insurance companies information about building materials and the style of construction. The thing that's interesting and unique about the Sanborn maps is that they often identified buildings where Chinese Americans lived and owned businesses, something they didn't do for any other ethnic group. And this was likely because of the racially based belief that buildings where Chinese Americans lived and worked were at a greater fire risk. The Sanborn Map Company updated the maps every few years, which makes them a valuable source for seeing changes in the built environment over time. And the first record we have for Oregon City is 1880. So though these sources provide a picture of the Chinese American community in Oregon City, and really during the 1870s, Chinese immigrants came to Oregon City and a Chinese American community began to take shape. So the 1860 census lists a single person of Chinese descent living in Oregon City. And this photo of 1857 gives you a sense of what the city looked like around that time. A decade later, in 1870, the census included 50 people of Chinese descent, so about 3.6 of the city's overall population at the time. And here we have Oregon City in 1866 to give you a sense of what it was looking like in 1870. In 1870, Chinese Americans were primarily working in two industries in Oregon City: wool and paper manufacturing. Others worked as cooks or in laundries, with at least one laundry being run by Chinese Americans. By 1872, Chinese Americans in Oregon City had formed a political and mutual aid society, and this is a really nice indicator of the Chinese American community that's taking hold. Those political and mutual aid societies were a great way to share information, to get loans, to kind of get connected into the community. More than any other occupation, Chinese Americans worked at the woolen mill. Oregon City Woolen Mills, which opened in 1865, was among the first companies to hire a significant number of Chinese American workers. During the first full year of operation, the mill employed 80 people and processed 300,000 pounds of wool. So this was a big operation in town. In 1866, Ralph Jacobs joined the Oregon City Woolen Mills as the vice president, and later he became the managing agent. His brother Isaac joined him on the board of directors in 1870, And as they became more involved in the mill, the brothers increased their financial commitment to it as well. And at some point by 1872, they became the principal shareholders and took over ownership. We don't know exactly when, but in that early 1870s period. So during 1867 and 1868, the wool manufacturing operation in Oregon City continued to grow. They added looms, machinery, increasing the amount of wool that they could produce, could process, and they increased their workforce as well. As the woolen mill in Oregon City was expanding, the textile industry across the state of Oregon was growing as well. At the end of 1868, the owners of the mill announced plans to temporarily close it. They explained their decision, stating that it was, quote, for the purpose of making a general overhauling of the machinery, to take account of the stock, and otherwise prepare for renewed business in the spring of 1869. And this overhaul included plans to hire Chinese Americans. The mill reopened in April, and in July, more Chinese Americans came to work at the mills. Many were expert weavers who had previously worked in textile mills in California. Weavers played an especially important role in the operation at the mill. They monitored multiple power looms at once. They were skilled at identifying and fixing problems as they arose. So the weavers were really the ones that ensured that the looms produced consistent cloth. So many of the Chinese Americans who came to work at the mill were a really key part of the operation. They were knowledgeable and skilled workers. Over the 1870s and into the 1880s, the number of Chinese Americans living in Oregon City continued to grow. And here we're seeing a photograph of Oregon City in the mid-1870s, and then that Sanborn map, as Michael mentioned, where you really start to see this Chinese quarter taking hold. The 1880 census enumerators recorded 101 Chinese residents in the city, and about half of those worked at the woolen mill. The overall population of the city at that point was just over 1,200. The 1884 Sanborn map reveals this emerging Chinatown, this cluster of Chinese-owned businesses and residents, including one shown here on this map as the Shanty Chinese Wash House. And the wash house is noted by the red circle on the map, and you can see it in the photograph about a third of the way up the photo. And you can also see the drying racks when you look at the zoomed-in photo. And today, these labels, such as Shanty Chinese Wash House, provide valuable information into the location of Chinese-owned businesses, even as they highlight those racially based assumptions of the map makers that I mentioned earlier. So what these sources, the Sanborn maps and the census records, which are both shown here, make clear is that Oregon City in the early 1880s had a significant Chinese community. Meanwhile, this period, the early 1880s, on the national level marked a significant change in immigration policy. The US passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And through the Chinese Exclusion Act, the US government sought to exclude the laboring class. Under this act, no new laborers could enter the country for 10 years. All Chinese immigrants, including the more than 100,000 people who were already in the United States, were denied the possibility of becoming natural US citizens based exclusively on their race. So this is really a big shift in policy to a much more racially based policy around immigration and citizenship. During the first few years of the Exclusion Act, it was, as the historian Beth Lou Williams has argued, weak both by accident and by design. Chinese immigrants continued to arrive in relatively large numbers. Documented immigrants tended to come through San Francisco, and those that did not have documentation were more likely to come across the US-Canadian border. So for this reason, Lou Williams argues that we should think about the years from 1882 to 1888 as a period of restriction that was followed by a period by the era of exclusion. So it was during this period in 1885 and 1886 that violence against Chinese Americans and efforts to drive Chinese residents out of communities throughout the West peaked. And as a result of this violence, some Chinese Americans lost their lives. Additionally, the violence displaced more than 20,000 people. Some people headed east, while others returned to China. A mob in Oregon City sought to drive out Chinese Americans who worked at the woolen mill in February of 1886. And a month prior, in January, the Oregon City woolen mills owners had responded to this growing anti-Chinese pressure. They first defended their decision to hire Chinese American workers on economic grounds. But in early February, they did respond to the growing pressure and fired about 30 Chinese American employees. They promised that they would fire the rest of the Chinese employees once replacement workers could be found. A few weeks later, a mob stormed the boarding house where many Chinese Americans working at the mill were living. That mob arrived at 2 a.m., forcing about 40 people to board a steamboat for Portland. A few months later, the circuit court indicted 10 people for the violent attack, but ultimately dropped the case. So the effort to expel Chinese Americans from Oregon City in 1886 marks a significant rupture. Between the Oregon City woolen mills firing of Chinese American workers and the violent expulsion, likely about 70 Chinese Americans left Oregon City, at least for a time. But this was not the end of Oregon City's Chinese American community. So it's very much a story of kind of holding both things. The expulsion did significantly change the community and it had an impact, but the Chinese American community remained, as Michael mentioned. Chinese Americans remained in Oregon City after the 1886 attack and expulsion, and they continued to be an important part of the fabric of the community. And as we looked at earlier, you can really see that in this comparison of the 1884 and 1888 map, which does show fewer Chinese-owned buildings, but still a presence. During the late 1880s, after the expulsion, Chinese Americans worked in a few different industries. They continued to run laundries. They worked at Oregon City's railroad station house. The station houses were responsible for the repair and maintenance of railroad lines. They also worked as truck gardeners, growing produce that they distributed to restaurants and to homes. A fire destroyed most of the 1890 census records for the entire country. So we don't have data on the number of Chinese Americans in Oregon City in 1890, a few years after the attempted expulsion. This 1892 Sanborn map includes Chinese American-owned businesses, such as the laundry, which you can see marked here in red. And these Chinese-owned laundries are also present on the 1900 and 1911 Sanborn maps. And here I want to take a moment to thank Michael for his careful attention to these photographs. He was the one who pointed out these drying racks that you can see highlighted in red, and they really make it's yet another evidence of this kind of hidden in plain sight. You kind of have to know what you're looking for, but once you do, there it is. In 1910, census enumerators recorded about 16 Chinese Americans, even as the rest of the Oregon City population grew. In 1920, census enumerators recorded only 2 people of Chinese descent living in Oregon City, and census records in 1930 and 1940 tell a similar story. But it's really important to keep in mind that that we know that the census records underreported the number of Chinese Americans living in Oregon City at this period. And, especially during the exclusion era, Chinese Americans would have had very little motivation to ensure that they were counted. They were already, as part of the exclusion era policies, being tracked and regulated. And so there would have been, no desire to kind of ensure that census records got those numbers as well. Like many cities in the West, the Chinese American population in Oregon City fell at the start of the 20th century, and scholars point to a lot of different factors for this. Chinese Americans were leaving the West in large numbers and settling in communities ranging from large cities to small towns throughout the country, in part due to that violence that we talked about in 1885 and 1886. So communities in the Midwest and the East grew up. Some Chinese migrants returned to China. Stricter immigration laws, and a key piece too is the stricter enforcement of those laws, meant that fewer Chinese immigrants were arriving in the United States. So it wasn't until after World War II that the number of Chinese Americans began to grow significantly once again. So I want to talk for a moment about how we approached this history. And this really gets at, kind of some of the ways that we wanted to think about hidden histories and think about histories that have not always been included in the official narratives. So drawing on the work of other scholars, we kept a few key frameworks in mind throughout our discussion of the history of Chinese Americans in Oregon City. And specifically, we drew on a diasporic framework, an approach to violent histories, and an emphasis on survivance. And I'm going to talk about each of those for a few moments. So, Oregon City, like any place where Chinese people migrated, must be understood within a diasporic framework. The Chinese diaspora connected Oregon City with cities and rural communities throughout the region, country, and across the globe. It created networks for the spread of people, goods, ideas, and culture. These migration patterns and networks emerged within historically specific context of capitalism and imperialism. And amidst these large-scale forces, Chinese people maintained connections to their home villages, and they drew on and cultivated relationships in the places where they lived, forging new identities as a community and individuals. So, forming a relationship in the new place they were living, but maintaining ties to their home villages as well. We also drew on frameworks to think about a history of violence. And as we've talked about, this 1886 attempted expulsion is a major part of the Chinese American history in Oregon City, but we wanted to really think about how to approach this history of violence. So we sought to locate moments of violence within larger systems of oppression and to recognize the humanity of those who experienced violence, seeing them not as passive victims, but as historical actors. At times, discussions of racism and violence focus on acts of interpersonal violence and acute events without adequately acknowledging the broader structures and institutions within which these events occur. And this can lead people to conclude that the problem is racist individuals rather than systems of oppression. And this conclusion, in turn, shapes the solutions that we imagine and pursue. Direct violence against Chinese Americans took many forms, including harassment, threats, arson, and assault. These acute events, it's important to remember, took place within the context of structural and institutional racism, violence, and oppression, which Chinese Americans in Oregon City and elsewhere experienced in their daily lives. On the local level, anti-Chinese vigilantes sought to drive Chinese residents out of their communities. On a national scale, they sought to demand Chinese exclusion. In the wake of these violent attacks, members of the Chinese community acted quickly, drawing on regional, national, and international networks to resist anti-Chinese efforts and to demand justice. So here we can really see these frameworks intersecting as well, thinking about approaching a history of violence alongside thinking about those diasporic networks. Those were really a key response. Chinese Americans employed many modes of resistance. They went on strike, filed lawsuits, including the first lawsuit for reparations. They even refused to sell vegetables to white households and pressured the Chinese government to get involved. So when you start to look at these resistance efforts, you can really see them happening in very day-to-day interactions and also on an international scale. We also highlighted survivance. The 1886 effort to expel Chinese Americans was a violent event that had a significant effect on the Chinese American community in Oregon City. And Chinese Americans remained in Oregon City and continued to be an important part of their community. So these frameworks informed our understanding of the history of Oregon City's Chinese community, and they guided our approach to a few case studies, which I'd like to turn to next. The census, which we've been discussing, is a really valuable source, but it is far from telling the whole story. And to learn about Chinese American community in Oregon City, we needed to do some focused research on some of the individuals who were living in Oregon City in the late 1800s and early decades of the 1900s. First, I want to tell you about Him Key. For at least 17 years, Himki operated a business in Oregon City, first a tailor shop and later a general merchandise store. And newspaper stories tend to offer glimpses into Himki's life, although they tend to highlight extreme, out of the ordinary moments rather than day-to-day life. And I'll mention here too, it seemed clear that Himki was most likely spelled in this way, but in terms of newspaper reports, another thing in tracking Chinese Americans is often one has to look for kind of multiple different spellings in order to try to kind of get glimpses at these individuals' lives. Interestingly, Himki is not listed in the census records for 1900 or 1910. The 1900 census record does identify two Chinese American tailors, Ker Him Ori and Ha Dao. Questions remain as to whether these two individuals had their own tailor shops or worked with or for Himki. Based on our initial research, we don't know when Himki arrived in Oregon City, but by 1896, he had opened a tailor shop. And it seems likely that this is the business that's marked in the 1900 Sanborn map as the Chinese tailor. And here on the map, you can see a really nice photo that gives you a glance of Oregon City at this time, but then also able to zoom in on Himki's tailor shop specifically, boxed in red in both the photograph and on the Sanborn map. So we know that Himki was among those who donated to a fund to aid the homeless in 1903, and this suggests his participation and commitment to the Oregon City community. In 1904, a fire broke out in his shop, and the owner of a neighboring business woke those who lived and worked at the tailor shop. In this instance, very likely Himki and others may have lived above the shop in this, allowing them to escape as their rooms filled with smoke. Himki stated later that he did not know the cause of the fire. He estimated his losses at around $3,000, with $2,000 of that being covered by insurance. Soon after, the building's owners began construction on a new commercial building to replace the one that had burned. And once it was completed, Himki reopened his business. By 1911, the Sanborn map no longer lists a Chinese tailor and simply identifies the building as Taylor. Newspaper coverage of a robbery around this time suggests that Himki very likely still operated his business from this location, or perhaps Key had sold the business to another Chinese American. We next get a look at Himki through this advertisement for his, or the list of his bill. We next get a look at him through the International Chinese Business Directory, in which his business is listed. So this kind of raises some questions. Did Key expand or change his business? Was the shift from from a tailor business to a general merchandise store about being able to claim merchant status? And this is really key. Being able to claim merchant status was one way that Chinese individuals were able to travel between the United States and China during the exclusion era. So, it's possible that Himki's business model may have changed, and it's also possible that he may have moved from primarily identifying as a tailor business to identifying as a general merchandise business for that merchant status. On this next slide, this is something that, again, I want to thank Michael for all of his work on looking at these photographs so carefully. And as the Himki, the tailor that we were just discussing, is highlighted here on this 1911 Sanborn map. And we get to see two other Chinese American-owned businesses. The next one outlined in green is a restaurant, and in blue is a laundry. And I'm going to talk next about the restaurant, so we'll take a look at that. We see these same three buildings highlighted here on this 1911 4th of July parade photo. So here we're looking at 1911. As we know from, as census records are indicating, Oregon City's Chinese American population is fairly low at this point. The census suggested around 20 people. and knowing that the actual number is higher than that. But one of the things that I really like that this picture highlights is that these three Chinese American owned businesses were sitting in a prominent location on Main Street, right along the parade route. Before we talk specifically about the city restaurant, I want to share some history of Chinese Americans' involvement in the restaurant industry more broadly. Chinese restaurants in the United States date back to the gold rush, when some Chinese immigrants opened restaurants primarily to serve Chinese miners. Non-Chinese miners ate at these establishments too, and everyone ate pretty much the same food prepared by Chinese chefs. And they continued much in the same way through the 1880s. The 1890s marks a significant shift as Chinese American restaurant owners began strategically to create the idea of Chineseness and create dishes specifically intended to appeal to non-Chinese diners, dishes like chop suey. It might at first seem surprising that chop suey restaurants took off at the same time the United States passed stricter anti-Chinese immigration laws and began enforcing these laws with new vigor. Chinese Americans were the recipients of anti-Chinese racism, but they still found ways to exploit and profit from white Americans' curiosity, attraction, and desire for an exotic experience. So at the start of the 20th century, more Chinese Americans were moving into the restaurant business. And this was one of the reasons for this was due to shifts in the laundry business, which had been one of the primary industries that Chinese immigrants had been involved in. At the start of the 20th century, some laundry facilities moved to larger scale, more mechanized facilities. And then in the 1920s, home washing machines entered the market and became more common. Another really interesting and key reason that Chinese Americans made the shift from laundry businesses to owning restaurants was a federal court decision in 1915. And that decision recognized restaurant owners as part of the merchant class, and then therefore able to claim the privileges of that class as well, which included travel between China and the United States. And historian Heather Lee has examined the significance of this decision within the context of the restaurant industry. During the exclusion period, Chinese Americans invested in restaurants to secure merchant re-entry permits, thereby enabling their travel. And this, Lee's argued, contributed to the rapid growth of Chinese restaurants in the early 20th century. As the market for restaurants grew more saturated, Chinese Americans started opening restaurants in small cities and rural communities. And this enabled Chinese American restaurant owners to reach new markets and create successful businesses. Chinese Americans opening restaurants in rural locations strengthened and reinforced the diasporic community networks as well. One of the key roles that those networks played was providing information about markets where there wasn't a Chinese restaurant, a good town to go to, and also providing sometimes loans to help get those businesses going. So a lot of support and information could be exchanged. So despite these strong ties, the Chinese Americans who relocated to rural communities sometimes experienced a sense of isolation, being physically distant from a larger Chinese American community. So it was a strategic decision to open Chinese restaurants in communities across the country. And in fact, this is very much still visible on the landscape today. In many rural communities where there's only a few places to eat, they continue to have a Chinese restaurant. So I want to turn back now to Oregon City. By 1905, a Chinese restaurant serving chop suey had opened on Main Street between 3rd and 4th Street. It went by the name Oregon Restaurant. John Young, a public historian of Chinese American history, has traced the evolution of Chinese restaurant names, noting that the earliest restaurants, as I mentioned, tended to serve Chinese customers. They typically used Chinese names written in Chinese characters. But as owners began to cater more to non-Chinese customers, you can really see a shift in the names. Some owners decided to transliterate their names, while others selected a Western translation of their names, something like Lotus Garden or Golden Palace, with the hope that the names would be easier to remember and pronounce for their non-Chinese customers. Another strategy was for owners to select a definitively American name like Liberty or Mayflower. The owners of the Oregon restaurant seemed to deploy this same strategy, asserting their connection and belonging to the state through the name of their restaurant. Throughout the summer of 1905, the owners of the Oregon restaurant ran advertisements in the newspaper for Chinese noodles and for chop suey. Then, the Oregon restaurant seems to have gone quiet. We don't know entirely what happened. Did it close? Did it change names? There's more research to be done. Another Chinese restaurant named the City Restaurant, possibly located on the same block, opened by 1907. And the first mention of the City Restaurant came in the form of an announcement by R. Kim that he had sold the business and planned to return to China. So presumably the restaurant had been open for months or years prior to 1907. John Wing purchased the restaurant. Throughout the fall of 1909, City Restaurant ran regular advertisements for 35-cent chop suey and 15-cent noodles, and one of which you can take a look at right now on the screen. A year later, the census enumerators recorded 16 Chinese residents in Oregon City, so it's not surprising that the owners of the City Restaurant were very much catering and trying to reach out to non-Chinese customers as well. By this point, the restaurant had been open at least a few years and had changed hands at least once. The 1910 census lists Young Chung and Young Sing as partners and the restaurant keepers. And in subsequent years, newspaper articles continued to identify Young Chung as the owner of the City Restaurant. Articles also linked Charles Young to the City Restaurant, sometimes identifying him as an owner. So this raised some interesting questions for me. Did Young Chung, Young Sing, and Charles Young all jointly own the City Restaurant? Did census takers or journalists mischaracterize their roles in the business? And perhaps we're seeing some of the evidence of that 1915 federal court decision at play, which recognized restaurant owners as part of the merchant class and so would have encouraged more investment by more individuals in owning the business. City Restaurant remained open until at least 1916, and so that may have shaped who invested in the restaurant in its later years. City Restaurant was located on Main Street, and as I mentioned, we very much think that it was located at 317 Main Street, although we don't know that for certain. We have only pieces of information about City Restaurant's owners, Young Chung, Young Sing, and Charles Young. Chung likely came to the United States for the first time in 1908 at the age of 45, but the 1910 census lists that he immigrated to the United States in 1880. So this too raises interesting questions. Did he arrive in the United States in 1880, or was this a strategic decision to provide an earlier immigration date, which would have set him as arriving in the United States before the Exclusion Act? The 1910 census offers only a mention of Young Sing, and Charles Young's name occasionally appeared in the newspapers in connection to police raids, but without a lot of biographical details. Oregon City newspapers published reports of police raids of the City Restaurant, which really evidenced the scrutiny that the City Restaurant was under. Even before the statewide prohibition of alcohol went into effect in Oregon in 1916, Oregon City passed a local ordinance restricting alcohol. In May 1915, 2 detectives visited several West Linn and Oregon City establishments and tried to purchase alcohol. They claimed that Li Peng, who worked and lived at the City Restaurant, sold them whiskey. Li Peng was arrested for selling liquor and fined $25 and given a 30-day jail sentence. Although once he paid the fine, the jail sentence was remitted. So not only did individuals face scrutiny, but also these individual cases became a means of racializing Chinese Americans as a whole and suggesting that they were a threat to the community. In 1912, a local paper reported that officers had arrested Charles Young on a charge of smuggling opium and that he was taken to Portland for a hearing. The article went on to assert The officers say a large amount of opium is being smuggled into the city by Chinese. Articles such as this, much like those that portrayed Chinese Americans as a threat to public health, serve to reinforce structural and institutional racism. The the city restaurant remained open in August of 1916, but it seems likely that it closed sometime soon after that. Earlier that year, Willard Hawley had purchased several properties between 3rd and 4th on Main with the plans to expand his paper company. And by 1925, we know that a paper pulp pile sat on the site where the city restaurant had likely been located. Next, I want to share with you about George and Joe. For over a decade, starting in 1897, George and Joe lived in Oregon City with his wife, Jenny, and children, Kenneth and Harvey, and he operated a clothing and dry goods store. Joe named his store the Yokohama Clothing Company, presumably after the city in Japan. In his advertisements, he most often emphasized his low prices and wide selection, but occasionally he noted his inventory of Japanese goods and ties to Japan. Additionally, it's interesting that the 1900 census lists Jenny's race as Japanese and her birthplace as Japan, while the 1910 and 20 censuses list her as Chinese and her birthplace as China. So the Joes' decision to highlight their connections to Japan may have been a strategic response to Oregon City's residents' simultaneous anti-Chinese bias and interest in things that they perceived as quote-unquote Oriental or exotic. Next, we have some great photos that show where George and Joe's dry goods store was located. So here you can see it on the 1900 Sanborn map as well as in the photo. And this shows her two really nice looks at Main Street that highlight his shop as well. George Joe quickly became embedded in Oregon City. An Oregon City newspaper ran a notice announcing the birth of his son, Kenneth. And this is all the more significant because journalists often ignored the contributions and activities of Chinese American residents in their communities. So it's significant that the birth of Joe's son was noted. During the first decade of the 20th century, as the US ramped up its regulation and surveillance of Chinese immigrants' movements, Joe traveled to China at least twice, being able to secure reentry permits as a merchant. After over 10 years in business in Oregon City, Joe's firm ran into some financial trouble. It's unclear exactly why Joe ultimately closed his store, but by April 1910, another business had opened in the same location. In 1920, Jenny, Kenneth, and Harvey Joe lived in Portland. Jenny Joe worked for a family as a cook, and the census enumerator listed Jenny as married, not widowed. So this raises some questions about why George was not included on that census. Was he in China visiting family at this point, or had he passed away? 20 years later, in 1940, both brothers remained in Portland. So future research might look into more about the Joes and kind of why they lost their business ultimately and how this shaped their lives and their decision to move to Portland. And it might also look into further ways that the Joes seem to kind of strategically claim a both Japanese and Chinese identity. So I want to bring us now back to the Tamwada Village site with several of the Chinese American owned businesses highlighted. During the 1870s, the Chinese American community in Oregon City grew, and the anti-Chinese movement grew as well. Some Oregon City residents sought to strengthen and uphold the laws, policies, and practices that tried to preserve the nation's rights and wealth for white settlers. Chinese Americans in Oregon City navigated structural racism daily, and at times it was punctuated by acute violence. The effort to expel Chinese Americans from Oregon City in 1886 marks a significant rupture between the Oregon City woolen mills firing of Chinese American workers and the attempted expulsion. Likely about 70 Chinese Americans left Oregon City, at least for a time. But as we know, the Chinese American community remained in Oregon City. and continue to be a significant part of the community. Chinese Americans responded to structural racism and acute violence in a number of ways. They pursued legal action, they demanded better working conditions, they exercised their mobility and ability to relocate, they circumnavigated immigration policies, and they embedded themselves in the communities where they lived. And this all becomes more evident when we look at the complexities of individual lives. People like George and Joe, who drew on his merchant status to travel between the United States and China, who may have strategically deployed a Japanese identity at times, who navigated financial setbacks and created a life in Oregon. So, in contemplating this history, we can kind of honor the people of the past that lived in and shaped Oregon City. And we can also tell a more inclusive history and perhaps imagine some more possibilities for the future. And I want to hand it now to Michael to speak a little bit more about some of the way this work might shape the way we think about history going forward.
Thank you, Laura. To end our time together, I would invite us all to consider some wider implications. Laura's presented stories of Him Key, George and Joe, the owners of the City Restaurant in its various forms. All of these are individuals who had businesses on Main Street, sometimes for decades, yet they don't show up or have not been present in the official histories of Oregon City that have come down to us. This is remarkable. And yet, this same dynamic is also quite familiar to the Grand Ronde community, a community who know this place as home. Grand Ronde ancestors also suffered removal, and the official narratives have ignored or erased the presence and survivance of Grand Ronde families in Oregon City. Today, much of the work of the Tribal Historic Preservation Office lies in helping Grand Ronde families reacquaint with their own histories. While the sources of information may be different, the work that Laura has presented today, and in particular the research method she has utilized, can be used both at Grand Ronde, but also in other communities whose ancestors are hidden in plain sight. All of us may have ancestors who are not prominent, wealthy, or headline newsworthy people. Ancestors who left behind few written records or references. I think this project shows us new ways to trace and understand the details of their lives. Further, everyone has a history in the places they have been. That's why one official narrative cannot capture our complex stories, and why holding and telling our histories must be done with care. And so, to Laura and Chelsea, Hayumasi, thank you for doing the scholarly work that lets us reacquaint with these hidden histories. To Kapiolani and the Portland Chinatown Museum, Hayumasi, thank you for providing a space for these stories to be shared and heard in the communities to whom they belong. To the leadership of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Hayumasi, thank you for providing support for this work and for lifting up the values of community knowledge and learning as taught by tribal elders. And to all of you in the audience today, Hayumasi, thank you for listening. I hope that the stories we have heard today inspire us to go out and become reacquainted with our own family and community histories. Our narratives may not always agree, but that's okay. The past is complex. By respectfully telling and hearing it through multiple voices and perspectives, we can begin to understand how our ancestors navigated their worlds and learn how we might better navigate ours. Hayamasi, thank you.
Thank you. It's Hayumasi?
I think so, but I imagine if we've got any Grand Ronde tribal members in the audience, they may correct my pronunciation.
Well, it's a wonderful conclusion to a beautiful presentation. And I know we have some questions in the chat to start with, but thank you so much. It was wonderful. I was riveted. Kapiolani, do you want to kick us off or?
Yeah, I
Um,
can you hear me okay?
yeah.
So we have some questions and comment in the Q&A. So the first one is, these Chinese woolen mill workers were all procured via labor contractors. The contractors paid the workers directly, not the owners of the woolen mill.
That is correct. The workers at the Oregon City woolen mills did work with a labor contractor to originally bring in several Chinese workers. And that is likely partly how the broader Oregon City community found out that there were going to be Chinese Americans working at the mill when it reopened after that period of about a 4-month closure. So, there still, though, was pressure put on the woolen mill as the employer about whether they were going to continue to keep Chinese Americans on the payrolls, heading into, and this was, they first, this was after kind of having Chinese American workers at the mill for 15 or so years. But over that time period, Oregon City residents would sometimes speak out and pressure the mill to no longer employ Chinese Americans. But you're absolutely right that contractors were involved in securing the Chinese American employees.
We have another question. Would the Chinese business partnership records at NARA and San Bruno have records of the businesses?
That's a really good question. And that is a great spot to look at to learn more about some of these businesses. I did look into several different repositories, including tracking kind of entry and exit paperwork, some of the questioning that would happen that would, during that entry and exit period. But I think looking specifically at some of those business records would be a great next step for some further research.
And then before I hand it over to Anna, there's a comment that mentioned that due to the 1911 revolution, especially before it was successful, businesses in southern China were in disarray and it was often easier to get goods to sell from Japan.
That's a terrific point. I'll say George and Joe was kind of some of this exchange and kind of publicizing that he was going to go to Japan for goods was happening earlier than that. But I think that that is a really interesting point and yet another reason why he likely was selling Japanese goods and advertising that as well.
Well, and I thought it was an interesting mixture of German and Japanese, especially because the Germans around that time, uh, the Austrians had the Wiener Werkstätte, but the Germans had another kind of craft guild that was very interested also in Japanese decorative art. So that was an interesting overlap as well.
Mm-hmm.
We have a combo of kind of question and comment from Trish Hackett Nicola, who we love your work too, Trish. Have you checked with the National Archives at Seattle for Himke and George and Joe's Chinese Exclusion Act case files?
I did look at the National Archives in Seattle in terms of what they had available online. And at least when I was doing this work, which was probably about a year ago, I was not able to find them. But one thing that continues to be exciting about some of this work is, more and more is being digitized, more and more is available. So it's worth continuing to check and to see if those files show up.
Yeah. And then Trish gave a little link, or not a little link, a link to she found that George and Joe on the 1910 census and provided a link. So we'll make sure to copy and paste that for everyone. And then before I hand it back to Kapi Olani, I want to note Judy Todd's question: how many years of the insurance company maps exist, along with kind of a shout out to her family. They're connected to, well, Judy is married to Dan Key, and they are part of the family that generously donated the Buki collection. So probably interested in, how much information can be found through that. So how many years, she asks, of the insurance maps exist? Sorry.
For Oregon City, I think we have at least 12. I'm doing this from memory, so you know, I may be slightly off. We've got 1884, 1888, 1890, I think, 1892, 1898. I think we have a 1900, 1911, 1924-ish. I
Mhm.
think it then jumps to 1943. There
Yeah.
might be a post-World War II, like 48, 49, a couple in the 1950s, and one, I think, in the early 1960s. But again, that's from memory. That's about the range. So I think around 12.
And the Oregon City website, the website put on by the city has some links to those Sanborn maps. And then another great spot to find them, you can get a little bit higher resolution maps through the Library of Congress. And, they're maps of cities all across the US. And so they are a tremendous resource.
They are,
Wonderful.
the originals are in color, and depending on your source, you may get a grayscale version. It's worth trying to track down the color, because there is information coded in that.
That's a good point.
Oh, we have a question from Chris. Is there any record of where Chinese residents of Oregon City were buried? Was there a section in Mountain View Cemetery where individuals of Chinese descent were interred?
That is a really good question. And I will say that is something that I have not looked into. I know that there are others that certainly have been looking into cemeteries, and that would be, yet another really fruitful next phase.
Then we have a comment from Sue that it was not uncommon for Chinese merchants living in rural communities to have their wives and children living in cities where there was a greater community support.
I really appreciate that. So that could be yet another piece of that's going on with the Joe family. Perhaps George Joe remained in Oregon City, was not captured in the census while the rest of his family went to Portland. At some point, it does seem like he passed away and his wife and two children kind of continued. But that's a really great point, and that would be another piece that to look into more.
Anna, I know you have a really great question.
I have two methodological questions that came about because of I really love how you both framed this presentation and the caveats that you gave to materials that we were looking at to help us kind of see the narrative at play. And so when you outlined your critical lenses or your methodological lenses, the history of violence, was something that was interesting to me. At the museum, we think a lot about, the other side to that story, which is the history of resilience. And just wondering if maybe, I know the risk is we don't want to tell a history that is inaccurate and to overlook those true and brutal details of our history. But I think in an interesting way, a history of violence is the history of the oppressor, right? Because the perpetration of violence on the oppressed, and the history of resilience is the history of, I love the term I've learned from our neighboring cafes community, which is instead of saying, um, uh, oh gosh, now I forget the term because I don't use it anymore. Marginalized populations, they say strategically undervalued populations, which I love. And so I just, your presentation made me think, maybe in the same way that we can teach the history of violence, is it a two-part history of violence and resilience, or do we say, let's teach the history of resilience because we're not ignoring the violent history, but we want to highlight the survive. And I think that your third lens was that seeming approach, right, with the survivance
Mhm.
uh, methodological lens. And just wanted to ask you about that, if there's discussion about that in your fields.
Michael, do you want to go first,
I
or
was gonna let
you?
I was gonna let you kick off.
Okay, perfect. Happy to. Well, I really appreciate that comment, and you're exactly right. I mean, I think in this, especially when thinking about Chinese history, having kind of all three together, that diasporic lens, along with that histories of violence and survivance, but resilience would be the other way that you might think about that, because so many of those strategies of resilience, we're drawing on the diasporic network. So I think that kind of combo of thinking of all three together really helped us understand this story and understand what's going on. But as you're mentioning, this history is one where, and I tried to, underscore this, you kind of have to hold both things. The attempted expulsion, was a significant event and something that we need to look at, and yet it's not the only story. So how do you kind of hold both of those things? And I think a piece that's helpful too with thinking about the histories of violence is, making a little bit of a shift from, instead of focusing only on individual events, recognizing that those are happening within that broader structure, which is exactly what that term you mentioned of kind of strategically undervalued kind of points to as well. So I think that bringing together that history of violence alongside a history of resilience within that diasporic framework really helps us understand the Oregon City history in a new way.
Definitely. Well, and I feel like you're present, together, you two really, and I forgot about that overarching diasporic because it had me also, it was so generative for me with, observations about how it related to the museum. And I couldn't help but think that diasporic lens helps you see that at least the community that our museum represents, there was a notion of being almost a citizen of the world, the courageousness with which you would take these, incredible journeys and go back and forth at a time when travel was not easy. So that I love that lens of the local, national, international. It gave me new perspective on a topic in our museum. So thank you for that.
We have a question from Marita. Where is the location of the Sweat Lodge in today's Oregon City?
Let's see. That's a complicated question. Um, I think I can say from the photo it's on the Westland side, but there has been a lot of modification. So I would not hazard beyond that.
From Dan, we have two questions about Sanborn Insurance. Was Sanborn Insurance also active in other Oregon cities? For example, Portland?
Laura, do you want to take or do you want
Yes.
me to?
And yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Ed. So, the Sanborn insurance maps, I'm not sure how small they get, and how complete the coverage is, but yes, they exist for Portland, they exist for Salem, they exist for a number of smaller towns, as well. There is presumably some point at which it just was not worth sending someone out, but I don't know quite where that break point is.
And then his second question about that, after Sanborn closed in 1970, do you know what company retains the records or continue to archive maps? And thanks with the exclamation mark.
Most of the records I've been using, we've pulled from Library of Congress, and I'm not recalling, we may have a second source that was sort of filling in gaps from that, but they were fairly low grade black and white images. So I'm not sure who has the archive.
There were enough copies printed and distributed that archives certainly do have a copy. So if you are interested in seeing them sometime, you can look at local archives and sometimes find a physical copy for your location. But certainly Library of Congress is the best spot for digital copies.
And then we have a comment from Carolyn to Anna, who wanted to point out the terms under-resourced and underserved are alternatives to marginalized.
Yeah. And I read that and thought it's along the same lines as like that when you tell the history of violence, whose narrative is that kind of maybe insidiously perpetuating, right? Even though I think that the way you guys set it up, it was a wonderful intersectional kind of perspective. And I wonder too, under-resourced and underserved, that I think is a great way of reframing that term and, strategically undervalued as well. But then now I'm really going into a rabbit hole of sorts in that I am starting to wonder how all of those words are in service or are counter to that dominant narrative. So perhaps a bit too much in the details, right? But I really appreciate that, Carolyn. I want to make sure that we don't have other questions out there. In case you had trouble with the chat, everyone, the Q&A is working. So I just wanted to make sure if someone had tried to put something in the chat, they know they can, the alternative is the Q&A. And so we will make sure to check that and convey your comments to our esteemed panelists today, just in case we missed anyone in that way. But we are, I mean, wonderfully right on time. I appreciate both of you so much for working all of that information into such a precise presentation. And then to all of our guests today, over 40, who contributed in the chat, both comments, pointers, and excellent questions. And so I want to say a big thank you to our presenters, Laura and Michael, and our wonderful audience for joining us today. If you'd like to rewatch this program or share it with others, a recording will be made available on our YouTube and our Vimeo pages by next week. And I just want to point out too, in case you can't see it, that applause and heart emojis are flourishing in the corner. And then just a reminder that today's event is the third of 6 Hidden Histories presentations. Our next and fourth presentation will be on Zoom on Saturday, November 15th. Oh, whoops. I might have that that date off. Let me just double check because I believe December 15th, excuse me, entitled Picturing the Past Part 2. Oh, yes, sharing Chinese American history through archaeology, art, and song. And the presentation features archaeologist Chelsea Rose, artist Dale Horn, and musician John Lee. You'll find more details about this presentation and links to register on our website and Facebook page by next week. And so again, that's December 15th. I just want to make sure that's right. Kapiolani, did I get that right?
It looks like Chelsea just mentioned that it's December 6th is what.
Oh, okay. My apologies, December 6th. And so again, December 6th is when we'll have that wonderful presentation. Thank you again for joining, for attending today's presentation, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks, everyone. Bye.